Good morning, and I'm just doing some videos to help you have lots of guidance as to what to do over the kind of coming weeks. So I'm going to be looking at poetry this week, maybe a little bit into next week as well, and then start going through some of the things to do with looking at literature, looking at non-fiction text, looking at fiction text. So today we're just looking at one thing, which is looking at an aspect of form. So I'm hoping this will be useful for anybody who's looking at a poem for their anthology, anybody who's looking at a poem as well in terms of unseen. And all we're doing today is really thinking about what aspects of a poem's form and what is form in order to be able to talk about it in the exam. So today what we're really just looking for is what is form? Because we talk about that, and I think that sometimes people don't even know what it is. So we're talking about something that we don't even know what we're talking about really. And I'm going to also give you some things that you can look out for as well. And we're going to look at three poems today in this video and the next video that are particularly taxing. They're the kind of poems that you are never going to get in the exam. And they are, in fact, I would say they are the hardest poems to talk about form ever. And if you could say some sensible things about them, then you could say sensible things about just about any poem that ever existed. So I'm going to give you some things that I would look out for every time I look at a poem in terms of what we've got there in terms of form. So for me, this is what form is, and this is not an exhaustive list, this is just some of the things that I look at. And it's basically everything that makes it look like a poem, rather than it making it look like something that's in a novel or making it look like what's in a play. So there's a little bit to do with layout, and layout for me is a subset of form. So it can be things like stanzas. So stanzas will be irregular verses for me. So if you've got, for instance, one group of lines, it's the paragraphing, isn't it, of lines in a poem. So it's how those ideas are paragraphed, how they are put together, the way that they're grouped. And so a stanza might have 3 or 5 or 10 or 15. It might be one continuous chunk. So the first kind of question I'm looking at myself is how are the lines grouped? And that might be irregular stanzas, especially in more modern poems, or it might be verses. So I would say the earlier the poem, the more regular it's likely to be, the more likely you are to find verses. But then modern poets also these days have got verses to choose from as well. And whenever I make a choice about what verses how I'm grouping the lines, whether it's 4 or 6 or 3 or however it is, as a poet, I'm making a very conscious choice about how I'm doing that. So that's interesting to me, and we'll look at some of the ways that applies. But stanzas will be irregular, and verses is where they're all the same. I'm also looking like whether there's a rhyme scheme or not. Now, it's really important that we're not just saying there's an A, B, B rhyme scheme or whatever it is. So what we do is we give a letter, and I'll show you how that works, to each rhyme group. So say for instance I had round and found, that would be one rhyme group, and if it were the first rhyme group that I came across, I'd give it the letter A. The second group then I would give a B to, so that might be, I don't know, I can't now think of any rhymes that rhyme, and all I'm thinking of is orange. It doesn't rhyme with anything. So those would be how I would allocate those A, B, B rhyme schemes and so on. Rhythm's in everything, and sometimes when I'm marking pupils' responses to poetry, they say that there's not a rhythm. There's always a rhythm. There's a rhythm in everything that we do. So there's a rhythm in how I'm speaking now. There's every time words come out, whether it's on paper or whether it's aloud, there's a rhythm, and we need to think about that rhythm. So for instance, if you're looking at a poem that's got a very strong rhythm, like Charge of the Light Brigade, rhythm will be important, and that's something that's very specific particularly to poetry, which is more concerned with musical aspects of words than perhaps prose or drama. So there's always a rhythm, whether it's a particular rhythm, whether it's a musical rhythm, whether it's got cadence and things like that, the words that you'd find in music. Those things are things that I would specifically find, I think, in poetry rather than in other things. That's not to say we don't find it in other things, and particularly if you're listening to somebody speaking, then you'll find a lot of rhythm as well. So if you're looking at the great orators, Martin Luther King, for instance, or Nelson Mandela, whenever they're speaking, they build up into that rhythm. And so we find that rhythm too in poetry. I'm also looking, when I'm looking at a poem, like how many words and syllables are on each line, and why are they like that? So why have they decided to have 7777 or not to have 7777? Why have they left a word on this line rather than the next line? Why have they maybe split up something? Why have they left it together? So words and syllables on each line are important because lines are something that's very specific to poetry rather than to drama or to prose, where the writer doesn't particularly care which words are on each line. I'm also looking at whether there's capitals. So for instance, if you're looking at half cast, or you're looking at checking out my history, how he uses capitals is important. We'll look at a poem by E. Cummings. That's really important, how he uses capitals as well. So things like that are distinct to poetry. Half rhyme or para rhyme, if you're looking at Wilfred Owen and other poets that are using half rhyme. Where I'm also interested in monosyllables and polysyllables and the sound of words as well, that can be influenced by form. And then we've got a subset of form, which I'll tackle in another video, which are specific types of form that have a history and what those histories mean. And as a poet, when I'm choosing a form for the ideas that I want to convey, what I'm doing is I'm picking out something that has a history already. So that's what I mean by form. And like I said, that's not an exhaustive list. There are probably lots of other things that I could add, but those are the main things that I'm looking for. And the first thing I do when I look at a poem and I'm not really thinking of anything particular, I'm just looking at it the first time, I'm just looking at it in general, I'm looking at all of those things really. And I'll talk to you later about how to pick out the things that are important, the things that are specific, the things that help the poet convey the big ideas. But for me, those are some of the things I might be looking at for form. So we've got a poem here, which is the beginning of Tiger Tiger by William Blake, and we're just going to have a look at the form here. So I can see this is one verse actually, so I'm not going to do a whole poem because that would be terrible. And it is in verses, so they've all got 4 lines. I can say that they're verses, so that's the first decision I make. And then I can see that rhyme scheme there, so I can see what we've got going on here. Oops. I can see with the bright and night, so that's the first rhyme I've come across, so that would be AA. And then I and symmetry, well, I don't want to give that a rhyme, but it's not rhyme, is it? Whether I would want to say that's half rhyme and it rhymes a little bit, I'm not quite sure. Or whether I'm going to decide that I and symmetry might rhyme to some people if that's the way that they spoke about it, is another thing, another decision as well. But there's a kind of rhyme, even though I and symmetry aren't a clear rhyme in how I speak. So that's something for me to think about. I'm also thinking about the rhythm. So I've got tiger, tiger, burning, bright. Can you see how the emphasis falls on the first syllable in each of those words? And I've got 2, 2, 2, 1. Tiger, tiger, burning, bright. And then in the next line, in the forest of the night. And you can see how that last stress falls on the last word. Sometimes when I'm working out stress, it's not really clear in English, so I often work back from the last syllables of the last word, because sometimes that can make it a bit easier. And I can see that it's coming in pairs now, that I've got a stressed syllable and then an unstressed syllable. So what immortal, can you see in that word immortal that I've got immortal, hand or eye, so that the little word or there is not stressed. So we can see there it's following that same tiger, tiger, burning bright, in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye, and that kind of falls apart on the last line. I don't think William Blake was particularly interested in the real mechanics of that, or that last line just is different, isn't it? It's important, by the way, that that last line is different, and we'll come to that later. So we can see we've got a very strong rhythm that I wouldn't necessarily find in prose, for instance, or in a play. Then I'm thinking about how many words. That's not important. There's no kind of symmetry in that. So I've got 4 in the first, I can't count, 6 in the next. The syllables are a little bit more important. So I've got tiger, tiger, burning, bright. So I've got 7. In the forest of the night is 7 again. And as soon as I can start to see that pattern, oh, that's interesting. Let's look at that last line. Could frame thy fearful symmetry. Not the same. So breaks away. And again, you see how we've got now a confluence of things. The rhyme breaks down on that last line, the rhythm breaks down on that last line, the syllabic patterning breaks down in that last line. It's all kind of all about that last line. I'm going to keep that for later because at the moment I'm just describing what the form is rather than thinking about what's important about that. I can see very typically William Blake has used the capitals at the beginning of each line, maybe got some half rhyme with that I or symmetry depending on how I feel about it. And I can see, I can't see a particular pattern in terms of monosyllabic words. That's not something that I can find there that's important. Or maybe see that in another poem. So we've got here the first of the tricky ones, which is by a poet called Gertrude Stein, and it's from a series of poem prose things called Tender Buttons, which tender buttons makes no sense to me, and you can see she's already dealing with something quite unusual. So she says this: a carafe, that is a blind glass, a kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt colour and an arrangement in a system to pointing, all this and not unordinary, not unordered in not resembling, the difference is spreading. Firstly, I'm not going to talk about what any of that means because I'm going to say now I don't really know. I've got some theories, but it's not important. Do I have stanzas or verses or rhyme? I mean, it looks like prose. I mean, you can see it goes end to end, edge to edge. So that's why you can't say, this is a clear poem. And I'm pretty sure if I gave this some year 7s, they would say, no, this isn't a poem. It's not in stanzas. You know, there's nothing about that that's in stanzas there. Rhyme scheme? No. Rhythm? Well, there's something that got a little bit easier to read with the all this and not unordinary, not unordered in not resembling. So we've got some interesting things there in rhythm. We don't have lines, so we can't say how many words or syllables are on each line. I can't say anything about capitals because it just looks like prose and they're at the beginning of sentences as we'd expect. You can see that's different, isn't it, between prose and poetry? That in poetry, a capital would be at the beginning of a new line, despite whether there'd been a comma or whatever or nothing on the line before, whereas in prose we've got capitals only at the beginning of sentences and certain other places as well, of course. So I really can't talk about that as a poem at all, but in the next video you can see I'm going to do something with that. A carafe that is a blind glass, and it's going to show you the difference, I think, between prose and poetry to help you think about, okay, that's what form is, because at the moment that's not a poem for me. It complies to none of those rules. Is it poetic? Yes, it's poetic, but that's not to say it's poetry. Okay, another one. So we have In a Station of the Metro by Ezra Pound, written at the same time as Gertrude Stein. You can see how they are kind of doing things to break down the conventions of poetry. So we have this: in a station of the metro, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So we have a choice about what words are on each line. That makes it a poem rather than prose. We have 2 lines, so it's continuous. We don't have stanzas or verses or any of those things. We've got 2 lines, so I could call it a couplet. That would be something in poetry. I'm thinking about rhythm and rhyme. The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. Crowd and bough, that's not accidental, is it? Bough is just a branch. Why didn't you say petals on a wet black branch? Because crowd and bough were purposefully chosen. So if you'd have said crowd and branch, that wouldn't have been the same. So we've got half rhyme there for me with the ow sounds. We've got something going on with the syllables maybe. So we've got the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. It feels also almost to me like petals on a wet black bough is almost not finished, and we don't have a full stop. Like, why don't we have a full stop and we've got that semicolon? This is not somebody who's messing around with punctuation. So what I can see there is some important things. I've already identified the couplet. I've got something there about the half rhyme. Could do something maybe about the rhythm. When I can start to say, okay, these are the things that I can notice about the form, then I can start to think about what are the important things out of the things that I've noticed about the form that fit with the big ideas of the poem. And that's what I'm going to discuss in the next video that will be coming up in half an hour or so.